Section 15 of the Rover. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Cairns, Naperville, Illinois. The Rover by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 15. Part 1. Catherine, going downstairs, found Peyrol still at the well. He seemed to be looking into it with extreme interest. "Your coffee is ready, Peyrol," she shouted at him from the doorway. He turned very sharply like a man surprised and came along smiling. "That's pleasant news, Mademoiselle Catherine," he said. "You are down early." "Yes," she admitted. "But you too, Peyrol. Is Michel about? Let him come and have some coffee too. Michel's at the tartan. Perhaps you don't know that she is going to make a little voyage." He drank a mouthful of coffee and took a bite out of a slice of bread. He was hungry. He had been up all night and had even had a conversation with Citizen Savola. He had also done some work with Michel after daylight. However, there had not been much to do because the tartan was always kept ready for the sea. After having locked up again Citizen Savola, who was extremely concerned as to what was going to happen to him, but was left in a state of uncertainty, he had come up to the farm, had gone upstairs where he was busy with various things for a time, and then had stolen down very cautiously to the well, where Catherine, whom he had not expected downstairs so early, had seen him before she went into Lieutenant Raoul's room. While he enjoyed his coffee, he listened without any signs of surprise to Catherine's comments on the disappearance of Savola. She had looked into his den. He had not slept on his pallet last night. Of that she was certain, and he was nowhere to be seen, not even in the most distant field from the points of vantage around the farm. It was inconceivable that he should have slipped away to Madraga, where he disliked to go, or to the village where he was afraid to go. Peyrol remarked that whatever happened to him he was no great loss, but Catherine was not to be soothed. "It frightens a body," she said. "He may be hiding somewhere to jump on one treacherously. You know what I mean, Peyrol?" "Well, the lieutenant will have nothing to fear as he's going away. As to myself, Savola and I are good friends. I had a long talk with him quite recently. You two women can manage him perfectly, and then, who knows? Perhaps he has gone away for good." Catherine stared at him, if such a word as stare can be applied to a profound, contemplative gaze. "The lieutenant has nothing to fear from him," she repeated cautiously. "No, he is going away. Didn't you know it?" The old woman continued to look at him profoundly. "Yes, he is on service." For another minute or so Catherine continued silent in her contemplative attitude. Then her hesitation came to an end. She could not resist the desire to inform Peyrol of the events of the night. As she went on, Peyrol forgot the half-full bowl of cereal and his half-eaten piece of bread. Catherine's voice flowed with austerity. She stood there, imposing and solemn like a peasant priestess. The relation of what had been to her a soul-shaking experience did not take much time, and she finished with the words, "The lieutenant is an honest man." And after a pause she insisted further, "There is no denying it. He has acted like an honest man." For a moment longer Peyrol continued to look at the coffee in the bowl. Then, without warning, got up with such violence that the chair behind him was thrown back upon the flagstones. "Where is he, that honest man?" he shouted suddenly in stentorian tones which not only caused Catherine to raise her hands but frightened himself, and he dropped at once to a mere forcible utterance. "Where is that man? Let me see him." Even Catherine's hieratic composure was disturbed. "Why," she said, looking really disconcerted, "he will be down here directly. This bowl of coffee is for him." Peyrol made as if to leave the kitchen, but Catherine stopped him. "For God's sake, Monsieur Peyrol," she said, half in entreaty and half in command, "don't wake up the child. Let her sleep. Oh, let her sleep. Don't wake her up. God only knows how long it is since she has slept properly. I could not tell you. I daren't think of it." She was shocked by hearing Peyrol declare, "All this is confounded nonsense." But he sat down again, seemed to catch sight of the coffee bowl, and emptied what was left in it down his throat. "I don't want her on my hands more crazy than she has been before," said Catherine in a sort of exasperation, but in a very low tone. This phrase, in its selfish form, expressed a real and profound compassion for her niece. She dreaded the moment when that fatal Arlette would wake up and the dreadful complications of life, which her slumbers had suspended, would have to be picked up again. Peyrol fidgeted on his seat. "And so he told you he was going? He actually did tell you that?" he asked. "He promised to go before the child wakes up, at once." "But sacre nom d'un chien! There is never any wind before 11 o'clock," Peyrol exclaimed in a tone of profound annoyance, yet trying to moderate his voice, while Catherine, indulgent to his changing moods, only compressed her lips and nodded at him soothingly. "It is impossible to work with people like that," he mumbled. "Do you know, Monsieur Peyrol, that she has been to see the priest?" Catherine was heard suddenly towering above her end of the table. The two women had had a talk before Arlette had been induced by her aunt to lie down. Peyrol gave a start. "What? Priest? Now look here, Catherine," he went on with repressed ferocity. "Do you imagine that all this interests me in the least? I can think of nothing but that niece of mine. We two have nobody but each other in the world," she went on, reproducing the very phrase Arlette had used to Rael. She seemed to be thinking out loud, but noticed that Peyrol was listening with attention. He wanted to shut her up from everybody, and the old woman clasped her meager hands with a sudden gesture. "I suppose there are still some convents about the world." "You and the patron are mad together," declared Peyrol. "All this only shows what an ass the curé is. I don't know much about these things, though I have seen some nuns in my time, and some very queer ones too, but it seems to me that they don't take crazy people into convents. Don't you be afraid. I tell you that." He stopped, because the inner door of the kitchen came open and Lieutenant Rael stepped in. His sword hung on his forearm by the belt. His hat was on his head. He dropped his little valise on the floor and sat down in the nearest chair to put on his shoes, which he had brought down in his other hand. Then he came up to the table. Peyrol, who had kept his eyes on him, thought, "Here is one who looks like a moth scorched in the fire." Rael's eyes were sunk, his cheeks seemed hollowed, and the whole face had an arid and dry aspect. "Well, you are in a fine state for the work of deceiving the enemy," Peyrol observed. "Why, to look at you, nobody would believe a word you said. You are not going to be ill, I hope. You are on service. You haven't got the right to be ill. I say, Mademoiselle Catherine, produce the bottle. You know, my private bottle." He snatched it from Catherine's hand, poured some brandy into the lieutenant's coffee, pushed the bowl towards him and waited. "Nom de nom," he said forcibly. "Don't you know what this is for? It's for you to drink." Rael obeyed with a strange automatic docility. "And now," said Peyrol, getting up, "I will go to my room and shave. This is a great day, the day we are going to see the lieutenant off." Till then, Rael had not uttered a word, but directly the door closed behind Peyrol, he raised his head. "Catherine," his voice was like a rustle in his throat. She was looking at him steadily, and he continued, "Listen, when she finds I am gone, you tell her I will return soon. Tomorrow, always tomorrow." "Yes, my good monsieur," said Catherine in an unmoved voice, but clasping her hands convulsively. "There is nothing else I would dare tell her." "She will believe you," whispered Rael wildly. "Yes, she will believe me," repeated Catherine in a mournful tone. Rael got up, put the sword belt over his head, picked up the valise. There was a little flush on his cheeks. "Adieu," he said to the silent old woman. She made no answer, but as he turned away, she raised her hand a little, hesitated, and let it fall again. It seemed to her that the women of Escambabar had been singled out for divine wrath. Her niece appeared to her like the scapegoat charged with all the murders and blasphemies of the Revolution. She herself, too, had been cast out from the grace of God, but that had been a long time ago. She had made her peace with heaven since. Again she raised her hand and this time made in the air the sign of the cross at the back of Lieutenant Riel. Meanwhile, upstairs, Peyrol, scraping his big flat cheek with an English razor blade at the window, saw Lieutenant Riel on the path to the shore, and high above there, commanding a vast view of the sea and land, he shrugged his shoulders impatiently with no visible provocation. One could not trust those epaulet wearers. They would cram a fellow's head with notions either for their own sake or for the sake of the service. Still, he was too old a bird to be caught with chaff. And besides, that long-legged, stiff beggar going down the path, with all his officer's airs, was honest enough. At any rate, he knew a seaman when he saw one. Though he was as cold-blooded as a fish, Peyrol had a smile which was a little awry. Cleaning the razor blade, one of a set of 12 in a case, he had a vision of a brilliantly hazy ocean and an English Indiaman with her yards braced all ways, her canvas blowing loose above her blood-stained decks overrun by a lot of privateersmen, and with the island of Ceylon swelling like a thin blue cloud on the far horizon. He had always wished to own a set of English blades, and there he had got it. Fell over it, as it were, lying on the floor of a cabin, which had been already ransacked. For good steel, it was good steel, he thought, looked at the blade fixedly, and there it was, nearly worn out. The others too, that steel, and here he was, holding the case in his hand as though he had just picked it up from the floor. Same case, same man, and the steel worn out. He shut the case brusquely, flung it into his sea chest, which was standing open, and slammed the lid down. The feeling which was in his breast and had been known to more articulate men than himself was that life was a dream, less substantial than the vision of Ceylon lying like a cloud on the sea. Dream left astern, dream straight ahead. This disenchanted philosophy took the shape of fierce swearing. Sacre nom de nom de nom, tenir de bon Dieu. While tying his neckcloth, he handled it with fury as though he meant to strangle himself with it. He rammed a soft cap onto his venerable locks recklessly, seized his cudgel, but before leaving the room walked up to the window giving on the east. He could not see the Petit Pass on account of the lookout hill, but to the left a great portion of the Uri's roadstead lay spread out before him, pale gray in the morning light, with the land about Cape Blanc swelling in the distance with all its details blurred as yet, and only one conspicuous object to his sight, something that might have been a lighthouse by its shape, but which Peyrol knew very well was the English corvette already under way and with all her canvas set. This sight pleased Peyrol, mainly because he had expected it. The Englishman was doing exactly what he had expected he would do, and Peyrol looked towards the English cruiser with a smile of malicious triumph, as if he were confronting her captain. For some reason or other he imagined Captain Vincent as long-faced, with yellow teeth and a wig, whereas that officer wore his own hair and had a set of teeth which would have done honor to a London belle, and was really the hidden cause of Captain Vincent appearing so often wreathed in smiles. That ship, at this great distance and steering in his direction, held Peyrol at the window long enough for the increasing light of the morning to burst into sunshine, coloring and filling in the flat outline of the land with tints of wood and rock and field, with clear dots of buildings enlivening the view. The sun threw a sort of halo around the ship. Recollecting himself, Peyrol left the room and shut the door quietly. Quietly, too, he descended the stairs from his garret. On the landing, he underwent a short inward struggle, at the end of which he approached the door of Catherine's room and, opening it a little, put his head in. Across the whole width of it he saw Arlette fast asleep. Her aunt had thrown a light coverlet over her. Her low shoes stood at the foot of the bed. Her black hair lay loose on the pillow, and Peyrol's gaze became arrested by the long eyelashes on her pale cheek. Suddenly, he fancied she moved, and he withdrew his head sharply, pulling the door to. He listened for a moment as if tempted to open it again, but judging it too risky, continued his way downstairs. At his reappearance in the kitchen, Catherine turned sharply. She was dressed for the day, with a big white cap on her head, a black bodice and a brown skirt, with ample folds. She had a pair of varnished sabots on her feet, over her shoes. "No signs of Savola," she said, advancing towards Peyrol. "And Michelle, too, has not been here yet." Peyrol thought that if she had been only shorter, what with her black eyes and slightly curved nose, she would have looked like a witch. But witches can read people's thoughts, and he looked openly at Catherine with the pleasant conviction that she could not read his thoughts. He said, "I took good care not to make any noise upstairs, Mademoiselle Catherine. When I am gone, the house will be empty and quiet enough." She had a curious expression. She struck Peyrol suddenly as if she were lost in that kitchen in which she had reigned for many years. He continued, "You will be alone all the morning." She seemed to be listening to some distant sound, and after Peyrol had added, "Everything is all right now," she nodded, and after a moment said in a manner that for her was unexpectedly impulsive, "Monsieur Peyrol, I am tired of life." He shrugged his shoulders and with somewhat sinister jocosity remarked, "I will tell you what it is. You ought to have been married." She turned her back to him abruptly. "No offense," Peyrol excused himself in a tone of gloom rather than apology. "It is no use to attach any importance to things. What is this life? Phew! Nobody can remember 1/10 of it. Here I am, and you know, I would bet that if one of my old-time chums came along and saw me like this, here with you, I mean one of those chums that stand up for a fellow in a scrimmage and look after him should he be hurt, well, I bet," he repeated, "he wouldn't know me. He wouldn't say to himself, perhaps, 'Hello, here's a comfortable married couple.'" He paused. Catherine, with her back to him and calling him not Monsieur, but Peyrol, to court, remarked, not exactly with displeasure, but rather with an ominous accent, that this was no time for idle talk. Peyrol, however, continued, though his tone was very far from being that of idle talk. "But you see, Mademoiselle Catherine, you were not like the others. You allowed yourself to be struck all of a heap, and at the same time you were too hard on yourself." Her long thin frame bent low to work the bellows under the enormous overmantle. She assented. "Perhaps. We as Camp-Bar women were always hard on ourselves. That's what I say. If you had had things happen to you which happened to me, but you men, you are different. It doesn't matter what you do. You have got your own strength. You need not be hard on yourselves. You go from one thing to another thoughtlessly." He remained looking at her searchingly, with something like a hint of a smile on his shaven lips. But she turned away to the sink, where one of the women working about the farm had deposited a great pile of vegetables. She started on them with a broken-bladed knife, preserving her Sibyllin air, even in that homely occupation. "It will be a good soup, I see, at noon today," said the Rover suddenly. He turned on his heels and went out through the salle. The whole world lay open to him, or, at any rate, the whole of the Mediterranean. Viewed down the ravine between the two hills, the belle of the farm's milch cow, which had a talent for keeping herself invisible, reached him from the right. But he could not see as much as the tips of her horns, though he looked for them. He stepped out sturdily. He had not gone 20 yards down the ravine when another sound made him stand still as if changed into a stone. It was a faint noise resembling very much the hollow rumble an empty farm cart would make on a stony road. But Peyrol looked up at the sky, and though it was perfectly clear, he did not seem pleased with its aspect. He had a hill on each side of him, and the placid cove below his feet. He muttered, thunder at sunrise. It must be in the west. It only wanted that. He feared it would first kill the little breeze there was and then knock the weather up altogether. For a moment all his faculties seemed paralyzed by that faint sound. On that sea ruled by the gods of Olympus, he might have been a pagan mariner subject to Jupiter's caprices. But like a defiant pagan, he shook his fist vaguely at space, which answered him by a short and threatening mutter. Then he swung on his way till he caught sight of the two mastheads of the tartan. When he stopped to listen, no sound of any sort reached him from there, and he went on his way thinking, go from one thing to another thoughtlessly. Indeed, that's all old Catherine knows about it. He had so many things to think of that he did not know which to lay hold of first. He just let them lie jumbled up in his head. His feelings too were in a state of confusion, and vaguely he felt that his conduct was at the mercy of an internal conflict. The consciousness of that fact accounted perhaps for his sardonic attitude towards himself and outwardly towards those whom he perceived on board the tartan, and especially towards the lieutenant, whom he saw sitting on the deck leaning against the head of the rudder, characteristically aloof from the two other persons on board. Michel also characteristically was standing on top of the little cabin scuttle, obviously looking out for his mate. Citizen Scaevola, sitting on the deck, seemed at first sight to be at liberty, but as a matter of fact he was not. He was loosely tied up to a stanchion by 3 turns of the main sheet, with the knot in such a position that he could not get at it without attracting attention, and that situation seemed also somewhat characteristic of Citizen Scaevola, with its air of half liberty, half suspicion, and, as it were, contemptuous restraint. The sans-culotte, whose late experiences had nearly unsettled his reason, first by their utter incomprehensibility and afterwards by the enigmatical attitude of Peyrol, had dropped his head and folded his arms on his breast. And that attitude was dubious too. It might have been resignation, or it might have been profound sleep. The Rover addressed himself first to the lieutenant. "Le moment approche," said Peyrol with a queer twitch at the corner of his lip, while under his soft woolen cap his venerable locks stirred in the breath of a suddenly warm air. "The great moment, eh?" He leaned over the big tiller and seemed to be hovering above the lieutenant's shoulder. "What's this infernal company?" murmured the latter without even looking at Peyrol. "Oh, old friends, quoi?" said Peyrol in a homely tone. "We will keep that little affair amongst ourselves. The fewer the men, the greater the glory. Catherine is getting the vegetables ready for the noonday soup, and the Englishman is coming down towards the pass, where he will arrive about noon too, ready to have his eye put out. You know, Lieutenant, that will be your job. You may depend on me for sending you off when the moment comes. For what it is to you, you have no friends. You have not even a petit ami. As to expecting an old rover like me, oh no, Lieutenant, of course, liberty is sweet, but what do you know of it, you epaulette wearers? Moreover, I am no good for quarterdeck talks and all that politeness." "I wish, Peyrol, you would not talk so much," said Lieutenant Real, turning his head slightly. He was struck by the strange expression of the old rover's face. "And I don't see what the actual moment matters. I am going to look for the fleet. All you have to do is to hoist the sails for me and then scramble ashore." "Very simple," observed Peyrol through his teeth, and then began to sing. "Quelques leurs chapeaux sont bien lads goddam. Moi j'aime les Anglais, ils ont un si bon caractère." But interrupted himself suddenly to hail Scaevola. "Hey, citoyen," and then remarked confidently to Real, "He isn't asleep, you know, but he isn't like the English. He has a sacré mauvais caractère." "He got into his head," continued Peyrol in a loud and innocent tone, "that you locked him up in this cabin last night. Did you notice the venomous glance he gave you just now?" But Lieutenant Real and the innocent Michel appeared surprised at his boisterousness. But all the time Peyrol was thinking, "I wish to goodness I knew how that thunderstorm is getting on and what course it is shaping. I can't find that out unless I go up to the farm and get a view to the westward. It may be as far as the Rhone Valley. No doubt it is, and I will come out of it too. Curses on it. One won't be able to reckon on half an hour of steady wind from any quarter. He directed a look of ironic gaiety at all the faces in turn. Michel met it with a faithful dog gaze and innocently open mouth. Scaevola kept his chin buried on his chest. Lieutenant Raoul was insensible to outward impressions, and his absent stare made nothing of Peyrol. The rover himself presently fell into thought. The last stir of air died out in the little basin, and the sun clearing porquerolles inundated it with a sudden light, in which Michel blinked like an owl. "It's hot early," he announced aloud, but only because he had formed the habit of talking to himself. He would not have presumed to offer an opinion unless asked by Peyrol. His voice having recalled Peyrol to himself, he proposed to masthead the yards, and even asked Lieutenant Raoul to help in that operation, which was accomplished in silence, except for the faint squeaking of the blocks. The sails, however, were kept hauled up in the gear. "Like this," said Peyrol, "you have only to let go the ropes and you will be under canvas at once." Without answering, Raoul returned to his position by the rudder head. He was saying to himself, "I am sneaking off. No, there is honor, duty, and of course I will return. But when? They will forget all about me and I shall never be exchanged. This war may last for years." And illogically, he wished he could have had a god to whom he could pray for relief in his anguish. "She will be in despair," he thought, writhing inwardly at the mental picture of a distracted Arlette. Life, however, had embittered his spirit early, and he said to himself, "But in a month's time, will she even give me a thought?" Instantly he felt remorseful, with a remorse strong enough to lift him to his feet, as if he were morally obliged to go up again and confess to Arlette this sacrilegious cynicism of thought. "I am mad," he muttered, perching himself on the low rail. His lapse from faith plunged him into such a depth of unhappiness that he felt all his strength of will go out of him. He sat there apathetic and suffering. He meditated dully. Young men have been known to die suddenly. Why should not I? I am, as a matter of fact, at the end of my endurance. I am half dead already, yes, but what is left of that life does not belong to me now. "Peyrol," he said, in such a piercing tone that even Scaevola jerked his head up, but he made an effort to reduce his shrillness and went on speaking very carefully. "I have left a letter for the Secretary General of the Majority to pay 2,500 francs to Jean. You are Jean, are you not? Peyrol. Price of the tartan in which I sail, is that right?" "What did you do that for?" asked Peyrol with an extremely stony face. "To get me in trouble?" "Don't be a fool, Gunner. Nobody remembers your name. It is buried under a stack of blackened paper. I must ask you to go there and tell them that you have seen with your own eyes Lieutenant Raoul sail away on his mission." The stoniness of Peyrol persisted, but his eyes were full of fury. "Oh yes, I see myself going there. 2,500 francs, 2,500 fiddlesticks." His tone changed suddenly. "I heard someone say that you were an honest man, and I suppose this is a proof of it. Well, to the devil with your honesty." He glared at the lieutenant and then thought, "He doesn't even pretend to listen to what I say." And another sort of anger, partly contemptuous and with something of dim sympathy in it, replaced his downright fury. "Pah!" he said, spat over the side, and walking up to Raoul with great deliberation, slapped him on the shoulder. The only effect of this proceeding was to make Raoul look up at him without any expression whatever. Peyrol then picked up the lieutenant's valise and carried it down into the cuddy. As he passed by, Citizen Scaevola uttered the word "Citoyen," but it was only when he came back again that Peyrol condescended to say, "Well, what are you going to do with me?" asked Scaevola. "You would not give me an account of how you came on board this tartan," said Peyrol, in a tone that sounded almost friendly. "Therefore I need not tell you what I will do with you." A low muttering of thunder followed so close upon his words that it might have come out of Peyrol's own lips. The rover gazed uneasily at the sky. It was still clear overhead, and at the bottom of that little basin surrounded by rocks there was no view in any other direction. But even as he gazed, there was a sort of flicker in the sunshine, succeeded by a mighty but distant clap of thunder. For the next half hour, Peyrol and Michel were busy ashore taking a long line from the tartan to the entrance of the little basin, where they fastened the end of it to a bush. This was for the purpose of hauling the tartan out into the cove. Then they came aboard again. The bit of sky above their heads was still clear, but while walking with the hauling line near the cove, Peyrol had got a glimpse of the edge of the cloud. The sun grew scorching all of a sudden, and in the stagnating air a mysterious change seemed to come over the quality and the color of the light. Peyrol flung his cap on the deck, baring his head to the subtle menace of the breathless stillness of the air. "Phew, Shashov," he muttered. Rolling up the sleeves of his jacket, he wiped his forehead with his mighty forearm, upon which a mermaid with an immensely long fishtail was tattooed. Perceiving the lieutenant belted sword lying on the deck, he picked it up and without any ceremony threw it down the cabin stairs. As he was passing again near Sivola, the sans-culotte raised his voice. "I believe you are one of those wretches corrupted by English gold," he cried like one inspired. His shining eyes, his red cheeks testified to the fire of patriotism burning in his breast, and he used that conventional phrase of revolutionary time, a time when, intoxicated with oratory, he used to run about dealing death to traitors of both sexes in all ages. But his denunciation was received in such profound silence that his own belief in it wavered. His words had sunk into an abysmal stillness, and the next sound was Peyrol speaking to Raoul. "I'm afraid you will get very wet, Lieutenant, before long." And then looking at Raoul, he thought with great conviction, "Wet? He wouldn't mind getting drowned." Standing stock still, he fretted and fumed, inwardly wondering where precisely the English ship was by this time, and where the devil that thunderstorm had got to. For the sky had become as mute as the oppressed earth. Raoul asked, "Is it not time to haul out, gunner?" And Peyrol said, "There is not a breath of wind anywhere for miles." He was gratified by the fairly loud mutter rolling apparently along the inland hills. Over the pool a little ragged cloud torn from the purple robe of the storm floated, arrested and thin like a bit of dark gauze. End of section 15. Recording by John Cairns, Naperville, Illinois. Section 16 of The Rover. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Cairns, Naperville, Illinois. The Rover by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 15, Part 2. Above at the farm, Catherine had heard, too, the ominous mutter and came to the door of the sow. From there, she could see the purple cloud itself, convoluted and solid, and its sinister shadow lying over the hills. The oncoming of the storm added to her sense of uneasiness at finding herself all alone in the house. Michel had not come up. She would have welcomed Michel, to whom she hardly ever spoke, simply as a person belonging to the usual order of things. She was not talkative, but somehow she would have liked somebody to speak to just for a moment. This cessation of all sound, voices or footsteps around the buildings was not welcome, but looking at the cloud, she thought that there would be noise enough presently. However, stepping back into the kitchen, she was met by a sound that made her regret the oppressive silence. By its piercing and terrifying character, it was a shriek in the upper part of the house where, as far as she knew, there was only Arlette asleep. In her attempt to cross the kitchen to the foot of the stairs, the weight of her accumulated years fell upon the old woman. She felt suddenly very feeble and hardly able to breathe. And all at once the thought, Sivola, was he murdering her up there? Paralyzed the last remnant of her physical powers. What else could it be? She fell, as if shot, into a chair under the first shock and found herself unable to move. Only her brain remained active, and she raised her hands to her eyes as if to shut out the image of the horrors upstairs. She heard nothing more from above. Arlette was dead. She thought that now it was her turn. While her body quailed before the brutal violence, her wary spirit longed ardently for the end. Let him come. Let all this be over at last, with a blow on the head or a stab in the breast. She had not the courage to uncover her eyes. She waited, but after about a minute, it seemed to her interminable, she heard rapid footsteps overhead. Arlette was running here and there. Catherine uncovered her eyes and was about to rise when she heard at the top of the stairs the name of Peyrol shouted with a desperate accent. Then again, after the shortest of pauses, the cry of Peyrol, Peyrol, and then the sound of feet running downstairs. There was another shriek, Peyrol, just outside the door before it flew open. Who was pursuing her? Catherine managed to stand up, steadying herself with one hand on the table. She presented an undaunted front to her niece, who ran into the kitchen with loose flying hair and the appearance of wildest distraction in her eyes. The staircase door had slammed to behind her. Nobody was pursuing her, and Catherine, putting forth her lean brown arm, arrested Arlette's flight. With such a jerk that the two women swung against each other, she seized her niece by the shoulders. "What is this, in heaven's name? Where are you rushing to?" she cried, and the other, as if suddenly exhausted, whispered, "I woke up from an awful dream." The kitchen grew dark under the cloud that hung over the house now. There was a feeble flicker of lightning and a faint crash far away. The old woman gave her niece a little shake. "Dreams are nothing," she said. "You are awake now." And indeed, Catherine thought that no dream could be so bad as the realities which kept hold of one through the long waking hours. "They were killing him," moaned Arlette, beginning to tremble and struggle in her aunt's arms. "I tell you they were killing him." "Be quiet. Were you dreaming of Peyrol?" She became still in a moment and then whispered, "No, Eugene." She had seen Raoul set upon by a mob of men and women, all dripping with blood, in a livid cold light, in front of a stretch of mere shells of houses with cracked walls and broken windows, and going down in the midst of a forest of raised arms, brandishing sabers, clubs, knives, axes. There was also a man flourishing a red rag on a stick, while another was beating a drum which boomed above the sickening sound of broken glass falling like rain on the pavement. And away, round the corner of an empty street came Peyrol, whom she recognized by his white head, walking without haste, swinging his cudgel regularly. The terrible thing was that Peyrol looked straight at her, not noticing anything, composed, without a frown or a smile, unseeing and deaf, while she waved her arms and shrieked desperately to him for help. She woke up with the piercing sound of his name in her ears and with the impression of the dream so powerful that even now, looking distractedly into her aunt's face, she could see the bare arms of that murderous crowd raised above Raoul's sinking head. Yet the name that had sprung to her lips on waking was the name of Peyrol. She pushed her aunt away with such force that the old woman staggered backwards, and to save herself had to catch hold of the overmantel above her head. Arlette ran to the door of the cell, looked in, came back to her aunt and shouted, "Where is he?" Catherine really did not know which path the lieutenant had taken. She understood very well that he meant Raoul. She said, "He went away a long time ago," grasped her niece's arm, and added with an effort to steady her voice, "He is coming back, Arlette, for nothing will keep him away from you." Arlette, as if mechanically, was whispering to herself the magic name Peyrol, Peyrol, then cried, "I want Eugene now, this moment." Catherine's face wore a look of unflinching patience. "He has departed on service," she said. Her niece looked at her with enormous eyes, coal-black, profound and immovable, while in a forcible and distracted tone she said, "You and Peyrol have been plotting to rob me of my reason, but I will know how to make that old man give him up. He is mine." She spun round wildly, like a person looking for a way to escape from a deadly peril, and rushed out blindly. About Escampabar, the air was murky but calm, and the silence was so profound that it was possible to hear the first heavy drops of rain striking the ground. In the intimidating shadow of the storm cloud, Arlette stood irresolute for a moment, but it was to Peyrol, the man of mystery and power, that her thoughts turned. She was ready to embrace his knees, to entreat and to scold. "Peyrol, Peyrol," she cried twice, and lent her ear as if expecting an answer. Then she shouted, "I want him back." Catherine, alone in the kitchen, moving with dignity, sat down in the armchair with the tall back, like a senator in his curule chair, awaiting the blow of a barbarous fate. Arlette flew down the slope. The first sign of her coming was a faint, thin scream, and really, the Rover alone had understood. He pressed his lips in a particular way, showing his appreciation of the coming difficulty. The next moment, he poised on a detached boulder and thinly veiled by the first perpendicular shower, Arlette, who, catching sight of the tartan with the men on board of her, let out a prolonged shriek of mingled triumph and despair. "Peyrol, help, Peyrol!" Rael jumped to his feet with an extremely scared face, but Peyrol extended an arresting arm. "She is calling to me," he said, gazing at the figure poised on the rock. "Well leaped, sacre nom! Well leaped!" And he muttered to himself soberly, "She will break her legs or her neck." "I see you, Peyrol," screamed Arlette, who seemed to be flying through the air. "Don't you dare!" "Yes, here I am," shouted the Rover, striking his breast with his fist. Lieutenant Rael put both his hands over his face. Michel looked on open-mouthed, very much as if watching a performance in a circus, but Sivola cast his eyes down. Arlette came on board with such an impetus that Peyrol had to step forward and save her from a fall which would have stunned her. She struggled in his arms with extreme violence. The heiress of Escampabar, with her loose black hair, seemed the incarnation of pale fury. "Miserable! Don't you dare!" A roll of thunder covered her voice, but when it had passed away she was heard again in suppliant tones. "Peyrol, my friend, my dear old friend, give him back to me." And all the time her body writhed in the arms of the old seaman. "You used to love me, Peyrol," she cried without ceasing to struggle, and suddenly struck the Rover twice in the face with her clenched fist. Peyrol's head received the two blows as if it had been made of marble, but he felt with fear her body become still, grow rigid in his arms. A heavy squall enveloped the group of people on board the tartan. Peyrol laid Arlette gently on the deck. Her eyes were closed, her hands remained clenched. Every sign of life had left her white face. Peyrol stood up and looked at the tall rock streaming with water. The rain swept over the tartan with an angry, swishing roar, to which was added the sound of water rushing violently down the folds and seams of the precipitous stone of the precipitous shore, vanishing gradually from his sight, as if this had been the beginning of a destroying and universal deluge, the end of all things. Lieutenant Rael, kneeling on one knee, contemplated the pale face of Arlette, distinct, yet mingling with the faint growl of distant thunder. Peyrol's voice was heard saying, "We can't put her ashore and leave her lying in the rain. She must be taken up to the house." Arlette's soaked clothes clung to her limbs while the lieutenant, his bare head dripping with rainwater, looked as if he had just saved her from drowning. Peyrol gazed down inscrutably at the woman stretched on the deck and at the kneeling man. "She has fainted from rage at her old Peyrol," he went on rather dreamily. "Strange things do happen. However, Lieutenant, you had better take her under the arms and step ashore first. I will help you. Ready? Lift." The movements of the two men had to be careful, and their progress was slow on the lower. steep part of the slope. After going up more than 2/3 of the way, they rested their insensible burden on a flat stone. Rael continued to sustain the shoulders, but Peyrol lowered the feet gently. "Ha," he said, "you will be able to carry her yourself the rest of the way and give her up to old Catherine. Get a firm footing and I will lift her and place her in your arms. You can walk the distance quite easily. There, hold her a little higher, or her feet will be catching on the stones." Arlette's hair was hanging far below the lieutenant's arm in an inert and heavy mass. The thunderstorm was passing away, leaving a cloudy sky, and Peyrol thought with a profound sigh, "I am tired." "She is light," said Rael. "Parbleu, she is light. If she were dead you would find her heavy enough. Allons, mon lieutenant." "No, I am not coming. What's the good? I'll stay down here and have no mind to listen to Catherine's scolding." The lieutenant, looking absorbed into the face resting on the hollow of his arm, never averted his gaze, not even when Peyrol, stooping over Arlette, kissed the white forehead near the roots of the hair, black as a raven's wing. "What am I to do?" muttered Rael. "Do? Why, give her up to old Catherine, and you may just as well tell her that I will be coming along directly. That will cheer her up. I used to count for something in that house. Allez, for our time is very short." With these words he turned away and walked slowly down to the tartan. A breeze had sprung up. He felt it on his wet neck and was grateful for the cool touch which recalled him to himself, to his old wandering self, which had known no softness and no hesitation in the face of any risk offered by life. As he stepped on board, the shower passed away. Michel, wet to the skin, was still in the very same attitude, gazing up the slope. Citizen Scaevola had drawn his knees up and was holding his head in his hands. Whether because the rain was cold or for some other reason, his teeth were chattering audibly with a continuous and distressing rattle. Peyrol flung off his jacket, heavy with water, with a strange air, as if it was of no more use to his mortal envelope, squared his broad shoulders, and directed Michel, in a deep quiet voice, to let go the lines holding the tartan to the shore. The faithful henchman was taken aback and required one of Peyrol's authoritative "Allez!" to put him in motion. Meantime, the Rover cast off the tiller and laid his hand, with an air of mastery, on the stout piece of wood projecting horizontally from the rudder head about the level of his hip. The voices and the movements of his companions caused Citizen Scaevola to master the desperate trembling of his jaw. He wriggled a little in his bonds, and the question that had been on his lips for a good many hours was uttered again. "What are you going to do with me?" "What do you think of a little promenade at sea?" Peyrol asked in a tone that was not unkindly. Citizen Scaevola, who had seemed totally and completely cast down and subdued, let out a most unexpected screech. "Unbind me! Put me ashore!" Michel, busy forward, was moved to smile as though he had possessed a cultivated sense of incongruity. Peyrol remained serious. "You shall be untied presently," he assured the blood-drinking patriot, who had been for so many years the reputed possessor not only of Escampibar, but of the Escampibar heiress that, living on appearances, he had almost come to believe in that ownership himself. No wonder he screeched at this rude awakening. Peyrol raised his voice. "Haul on the line, Michel." As directly the ropes had been let go, the tartan had swung clear of the shore. The movement given her by Michel carried her towards the entrance by which the basin communicated with the cove. Peyrol attended to the helm, and in a moment, gliding through the narrow gap, the tartan, carrying her way, shot out almost into the middle of the cove. A little wind could be felt running light wrinkles over the water, but outside the overshadowed sea was already speckled with white caps. Peyrol helped Michel to haul aft the sheets and then went back to the tiller. The pretty, spick-and-span craft had been lying idle for so long began to glide into the wide world. Michel gazed at the shore as if lost in admiration. Citizen Scaevola's head had fallen on his knees, while his nerveless hands clasped his legs loosely. He was the very image of dejection. "Eh, Michel, come here and cast loose the citizen." It is only fair that he should be untied for a little excursion at sea." When his order had been executed, Peyrol addressed himself to the desolate figure on the deck. "Like this, should the tartan get capsized in a squall, you will have an equal chance with us to swim for your life." Scaevola disdained to answer. He was engaged in biting his knee with rage in a stealthy fashion. "You came on board for some murderous purpose. Who you were after, unless it was myself, God only knows. I feel quite justified in giving you a little outing at sea. I won't conceal from you, citizen, that it may not be without risk to life or limb, but you have only yourself to thank for being here." As the tartan drew clear of the cove, she felt more the weight of the breeze and darted forward with a lively motion. A vaguely contented smile lighted up Michel's hairy countenance. "She feels the sea," said Peyrol, who enjoyed the swift movement of the vessel. "This is different from your lagoon, Michel." "To be sure," said Michel with becoming gravity. "Doesn't it seem funny to you, as you look back at the shore, to think that you have left nothing and nobody behind?" Michel assumed the aspect of a man confronted by an intellectual problem. Since he had become Peyrol's henchman, he had lost the habit of thinking altogether. Directions and orders were easy things to apprehend, but a conversation with him who he called notre maître was a serious matter demanding great and concentrated attention. "Possibly," he muttered, looking strangely self-conscious. "Well, you are lucky. Take my word for it," said the Rover, watching the course of his little vessel along the head of the peninsula. "You have not even a dog to miss you." "I have only you, Mitch Peyrol." "That's what I was thinking," said Peyrol half to himself, while Michel, who had good sea legs, kept his balance to the movements of the craft without taking his eyes from the Rover's face. "No," Peyrol exclaimed suddenly after a moment of meditation. "I could not leave you behind." He extended his open palm towards Michel. "Put your hand in there," he said. Michel hesitated for a moment before this extraordinary proposal. At last he did so, and Peyrol, holding the bereaved fisherman's hand in a powerful grip, said, "If I had gone away by myself, I would have left you marooned on this earth like a man thrown out to die on a desert island." Some dim perception of the solemnity of that occasion seemed to enter Michel's primitive brain. He connected Peyrol's words with the sense of his own insignificant position at the tail of all mankind, and timidly he murmured with his clear, innocent glance unclouded the fundamental axiom of his philosophy: "Somebody must be last in this world. Well then, you will have to forgive me all that may happen between this and the hour of sunset." The tartan, obeying the helm, fell off before the wind, with her head to the eastward. Peyrol murmured, "She has not forgotten how to walk the seas." His unsubdued heart, heavy for so many days, had a moment of buoyancy, the illusion of immense freedom. At that moment, Rael, amazed at finding no tartan in the basin, was running madly towards the cove, where he was sure Peyrol must be waiting to give her up to him. He ran out onto the very rock on which Peyrol's late prisoner had sat after his escape, too tired to care, yet cheered by the hope of liberty. But Rael was in a worse plight. He could see no shadowy form through the thin veil of rain which pitted the sheltered piece of water framed in the rocks. The little craft had been spirited away. Impossible. There must be something wrong with his eyes. Again, the barren hillsides echoed the name of Peyrol, shouted with all the force of Rael's lungs. He shouted it only once, and about 5 minutes afterwards appeared at the kitchen door panting, streaming with water as if he had fought his way up from the bottom of the sea. In the tall-backed armchair Arlette lay with her limbs relaxed, her head on Catherine's arm, her face white as death. He saw her open her black eyes, enormous, and, as if not of this world, he saw old Catherine turn her head, heard a cry of surprise, and saw a sort of struggle beginning between the two women. He screamed at them like a madman, "Peyrol has betrayed me," and in an instant, with a bang on the door, he was gone. The rain had ceased. Above his head, the unbroken mass of clouds moved to the eastward, and he moved in the same direction, as if he too were driven by the wind up the hillside towards the lookout, When he reached the spot and gasping, flung one arm round the trunk of the leaning tree, the only thing he was aware of during the somber pause in the unrest of the elements was the distracting turmoil of his thoughts. After a moment, he perceived through the rain the English ship with her topsails lowered on the caps, forging ahead slowly across the northern entrance of the Petite Pass. His distress fastened insanely on the notion of there being a connection between that enemy ship and Peyrol's inexplicable conduct. That old man had always meant to go himself, and when, a moment after, looking to the southward, he made out the shadow of the tartan coming round the land in the midst of another squall, he muttered to himself a bitter, "Of course." She had both her sails set. Peyrol was indeed pressing her to the utmost in his shameful haste to traffic with the enemy. The truth was that from the position in which Raoul first saw him, Peyrol could not yet see the English ship, and held confidently on his course up the middle of the strait. The man-of-war and the little tartan saw each other quite unexpectedly at a distance that was a very little over a mile. Peyrol's heart flew into his mouth at finding himself so close to the enemy. On board the Amelia, at first no notice was taken. It was simply a tartan making for shelter on the north side of the Peyrol. But when Peyrol suddenly altered his course, the master of the man-of-war, noticing the maneuver, took up the long glass for a look. Captain Vincent was on deck and agreed with the master's remark that there was a craft acting suspiciously. Before the Amelia could come round in the heavy squall, Peyrol was already under the battery of Peyrol and, so far, safe from capture. Captain Vincent had no mind to bring his ship within the reach of the battery and risk damage in his rigging or hull for the sake of a small coaster. However, the tale brought on board by Simons of his discovery of a hidden craft, of his capture, and his wonderful escape had made every tartan an object of interest to the whole ship's company. The Amelia remained hove to in the strait while her officers watched, the lateen sails gliding to and fro under the protecting muzzles of the guns. Captain Vincent himself had been impressed by Peyrol's maneuver. Coasting craft, as a rule, were not afraid of the Amelia. After taking a few turns on the quarterdeck, he ordered Simons to be called aft. The hero of a unique and mysterious adventure, which had been the only subject of talk on board the corvette for the last 24 hours, came along rolling, hat in hand, and enjoying a secret sense of his importance. "Take the glass," said the captain, "and have a look at that vessel under the land. Is she anything like the tartan that you say you have been aboard of?" Simons was very positive. "I think I can swear to those painted mastheads, your honor, in the last thing I remember before that murderous ruffian knocked me senseless. The moon shone on them. I can make them out now with the glass. As to the fellow boasting to him that the tartan was a dispatch boat and had already made some trips, well, Simons begged his honor to believe that the beggar was not sober at the time. He did not care what he blurted out. The best proof of his condition was that he went away to fetch the soldiers and forgot to come back. The murderous old ruffian, you see, your honor," continued Simons, "he thought I was not likely to escape after getting a blow that would have killed 9 out of any 10 men. So he went away to boast of what he had done before the people ashore, because one of his chums worse than himself came down thinking he would kill me with a damn big manure fork. Saving your honor's presence. A regular savage he was." Simons paused, staring as if astonished at the marvels of his own tale. The old master, standing at his captain's elbow, observed in a dispassionate tone that anyway, that peninsula was not a bad jumping-off place for a craft intending to slip through the blockade. Simons, not being dismissed, waited, hat in hand, while Captain Vincent directed the master to fill on the ship and stand a little nearer to the battery. It was done, and presently there was a flash of a gun low down on the water's edge, and a shot came skipping in the direction of the Amelia. It fell very short, but Captain Vincent judged the ship was close enough, and ordered her to be hove to again. Then Simons was told to take a look through the glass once more. After a long interval he lowered it and spoke impressively to his captain. I can make out 3 heads aboard, your honor, and one is white. I would swear to that white head anywhere." Captain Vincent made no answer. All this seemed very odd to him, but after all it was possible. The craft had certainly acted suspiciously. He spoke to the first lieutenant in a half-vexed tone. "He has done a rather smart thing. He will dodge here till dark and then get away. It is perfectly absurd. I don't want to send the boats too close to the battery, and if I do, he may simply sail away from them and be round the land long before we are ready to give him chase. Darkness will be his best friend. However, we will keep a watch on him in case he is tempted to give us the slip late in the afternoon. In that case, we will have a good try to catch him. If he has anything aboard, I should like to get hold of it. It may be of some importance after all." On board the tartan, Peyrol put his own interpretation on the ship's movements. His object had been attained. The corvette had marked him for her prey. Satisfied as to that, Peyrol watched his opportunity and taking advantage of a long squall with rain thick enough to blur the form of the English ship, he left the shelter of the battery to lead the Englishmen a dance and keep up his character of a man anxious to avoid capture. Raoul, from his position on the lookout, saw in the thinning downpour the pointed lateen sails glide round the north end of Peyrol and vanish behind the land. Some time afterwards the Amelia made sail in a manner that put it beyond doubt that she meant to chase. Her lofty canvas was shut off too presently by the land of Peyrol. When she had disappeared, Raoul turned to Arlette. "Let us go," he said. Arlette, stimulated by the short glimpse of Raoul at the kitchen door, whom she had taken for a vision of a lost man calling her to follow him to the end of the world, had torn herself out of the old woman's thin, bony arms, which could not cope with the struggles of her body and the fierceness of her spirit. She had run straight to the lookout, though there was nothing to guide her there except a blind impulse to seek Raoul wherever he might be. He was not aware of her having found him until she seized hold of his arm with a suddenness, energy, and determination of which no one with a clouded mind could have been capable. He felt himself being taken possession of in a way that tore all his scruples out of his breast. Holding on to the trunk of the tree, he threw his other arm around her waist, and when she confessed to him that she did not know why she had run up there, but that if she had not found him, she would have thrown herself over the cliff, he tightened his clasp with sudden exultation, as though she had been a gift prayed for instead of a stumbling block for his pedantic conscience. Together they walked back. In the failing light, the buildings awaited them, lifeless, the walls darkened by rain and the big slopes of the roofs glistening and sinister under the flying desolation of the clouds. In the kitchen, Catherine heard their mingled footsteps, and rigid in the tall armchair awaited their coming. Arlette threw her arms round the old woman's neck, while Raoul stood on one side looking on. Thought after thought flew through his mind and vanished in the strong feeling of the irrevocable nature of the event handing him to the woman whom, in the revulsion of his feelings, he was inclined to think more sane than himself. Arlette, with one arm over the old woman's shoulders, kissed the wrinkled forehead under the white band of linen that, on the erect head, had the effect of a rustic diadem. "Tomorrow you and I will have to walk down to the church." The austere dignity of Catherine's pose seemed to be shaken by this proposal to lead before the God with whom she had made her peace long ago, that unhappy girl chosen to share in the guilt of impious and unspeakable horrors which had darkened her mind. Arlette, still stooping over her aunt's face, extended a hand towards Raoul, who, making a step forward, took it silently into his grasp. "Oh yes, you will, aunt," insisted Arlette. "You will have to come with me to pray for Peyrol, whom you and I shall never see any more." Catherine's head dropped, whether in assent or grief, and Raoul felt an unexpected and profound emotion, for he too was convinced that none of the 3 persons in the farm would ever see Peyrol again. It was as though the rover of the wide seas had left them to themselves on a sudden impulse of scorn, of magnanimity, of a passion weary of itself. However come by, Rael was ready to clasp forever to his breast that woman touched by the red hand of the revolution, for she, whose little feet had run ankle deep through the terrors of death, had brought to him the sense of triumphant life. End of section 16. Recording by John Cairns, Naperville, Illinois.
Section 17 of The Rover. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Theoden Humphrey. The Rover by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 16, Part 1. Astern of the tartan, the sun, about to set, kindled a streak of dull crimson glow between the darkening sea and the overcast sky. The peninsula of Gagin and the islands of Hyères formed one mass of land, detaching itself, very black, against the fiery girdle of the horizon. But to the north, the long stretch of the Alpine coast continued beyond sight, its endless sinuosities under the stooping clouds. The tartan seemed to be rushing, together with the run of the waves, into the arms of the oncoming night. A little more than a mile away, on her lee quarter, the Amelia, under all plain sail, pressed to the end of the chase. It had lasted now for a good many hours, for Peyrol, when slipping away, had managed to get the advantage of the Amelia from the very start. While still within the large sheet of smooth water which is called the Hyères roadstead, the tartan, which was already a craft of extraordinary speed, managed to gain positively on the sloop. Afterwards, by suddenly darting down the eastern passage between the two last islands of the group, Peyrol actually got out of sight of the chasing ship, being hidden by the Ile du Levant for a time. The Amelia, having to tack twice in order to follow, lost ground once more. Emerging into the open sea, she had to tack again, and then the position became that of a stern chase, which proverbially is known as a long chase. Peyrol's skillful seamanship had twice extracted from Captain Vincent a low murmur accompanied by a significant compression of lips. At one time the Amelia had been near enough the tartan to send a shot ahead of her. That one was followed by another, which whizzed extraordinarily close to the mastheads. But then Captain Vincent ordered the gun to be secured again. He said to his first lieutenant, who, his speaking trumpet in hand, kept at his elbow, "We must not sink that craft on any account. If we could get only an hour's calm, we would carry her with the boats." The lieutenant remarked that there was no hope of a calm, for the next 24 hours at least. "No," said Captain Vincent, "and in about an hour it will be dark, and then he may very well give us the slip. The coast is not very far off, and there are batteries on both sides of Fréjus, under any of which he will be as safe from capture as though he were hove up on the beach. And look," he exclaimed after a moment's pause, "this is what the fellow means to do." "Yes, sir," said the lieutenant, keeping his eyes on the white speck ahead, dancing lightly on the short Mediterranean waves. "He is keeping off the wind." "We will have him in less than an hour," said Captain Vincent, and made as if he meant to rub his hands, but suddenly leaned his elbow on the rail. "After all," he went on, "properly speaking, it is a race between the Amelia and the night." "And it will be dark early today," said the first lieutenant, swinging the speaking trumpet by its lanyard. "Shall we take the yards off the backstays, sir?" "No," said Captain Vincent. "There is a clever seaman aboard that tartan. He is running off now, but at any time he may haul up again. We must not follow him too closely, or we shall lose the advantage which we have now. That man is determined on making his escape." If those words, by some miracle, could have been carried to the ears of Peyrol, they would have brought to his lips a smile of malicious and triumphant exultation. Ever since he had laid his hand on the tiller of the tartan, every faculty of his resourcefulness and seamanship had been bent on deceiving the English captain, that enemy whom he had never seen, the man whose mind he had constructed for himself from the evolutions of his ship. Leaning against the heavy tiller, he addressed Michel, breaking the silence of the strenuous afternoon. "This is the moment," his deep voice uttered quietly. "Ease off the main sheet, Michel. A little now only." When Michel returned to the place where he had been sitting to windward, the rover noticed his eyes fixed on his face wonderingly. Some vague thoughts had been forming themselves slowly, incompletely, in Michel's brain. Peyrol met the utter innocence of the unspoken inquiry with a smile that, beginning sardonically on his manly and sensitive mouth, ended in something resembling tenderness. "That's so, Conrad," he said with a particular stress and intonation, as if those words contained a full and sufficient answer. Most unexpectedly, Michel's round and generally staring eyes blinked, as if dazzled. He, too, produced from somewhere in the depths of his being a queer, misty smile, from which Peyrol averted his gaze. "Where's the citizen?" he asked, bearing hard against the tiller and staring straight ahead. "He hasn't gone overboard, is he? I don't seem to have seen him since we rounded the land near Peyrol Castle." Michel, after craning his head forward to look over the edge of the deck, announced that Chauvelin was sitting on the keelson. "Go forward," said Peyrol, "and ease off the foresheet now a little. This tartan has wings," he added to himself. Alone on the afterdeck, Peyrol turned his head to look at the Amelia. That ship, in consequence of holding her wind, was now crossing obliquely the wake of the tartan. At the same time, she had diminished the distance. Nevertheless, Peyrol considered that, had he really meant to escape, his chances were as 8 to 10, practically an assured success. For a long time he had been contemplating the lofty pyramid of canvas towering against the fading red belt on the sky, when a lamentable groan made him look round. It was Chauvelin. The citizen had adopted the mode of progression on all fours, and while Peyrol looked at him he rolled to leeward, saved himself rather cleverly from going overboard, and holding on desperately to a cleat, shouted in a hollow voice, pointing with the other hand as if he had made a tremendous discovery, "La terre! La terre!" "Certainly," said Peyrol, steering with extreme nicety. "What of that?" "I don't want to be drowned," cried the citizen, in his new hollow voice. Peyrol reflected a bit before he spoke in a serious tone. "If you stay where you are, I assure you that you will," he glanced rapidly over his shoulder at the Amelia, "not die by drowning." He jerked his head sideways. "I know that man's mind." "What man? Whose mind?" yelled Chauvelin with intense eagerness and bewilderment. "We are only 3 on board." But Peyrol's mind was contemplating maliciously the figure of a man with long teeth, in a wig, and with large buckles to his shoes. Such was his ideal conception of what the captain of the Amelia ought to look like. That officer, whose naturally good-humored face wore then a look of severe resolution, had beckoned his first lieutenant to his side again. "We are gaining," he said quietly. "I intend to close with him to windward. We won't risk any of his tricks. It is very difficult to outmaneuver a Frenchman, as you know. Send a few armed marines on the forecastle ahead. I am afraid the only way to get hold of this tartan is to disable the men on board of her. I wish to goodness I could think of some other. When we close with her, let the marines fire a well-aimed volley. You must get some marines to stand by aft as well. I hope we may shoot away his halyards. Once his sails are down on his deck, he is ours for the trouble of putting a boat over the side." For more than half an hour, Captain Vincent stood silent, elbow on rail, keeping his eye on the tartan, while on board the latter, Peyrol steered silent and watchful, but intensely conscious of the enemy ship holding on her relentless pursuit. The narrow red band was dying out of the sky. The French coast, black against the fading light, merged into the shadows gathering in the eastern board. Citizen Chauvelin, somewhat soothed by the assurance that he would not die by drowning, had elected to remain quiet where he had fallen, not daring to trust himself to move on the lively deck. Michel, squatting to windward, gazed intently at Peyrol in expectation of some order at any minute. But Peyrol uttered no word and made no sign. From time to time a burst of foam flew over the tartan, or a splash of water would come aboard with a scurrying noise. It was not till the corvette had got within a long gunshot from the tartan that Peyrol opened his mouth. "No!" he burst out, loud in the wind, as if giving vent to long, anxious thinking. "No! I could not have left you behind with not even a dog for company. Devil take me if I don't think you would not have thanked me for it either. What do you say to that, Michel?" A half-puzzled smile dwelt persistently on the guileless countenance of the ex-fisherman. He stated what he had always thought in respect of Peyrol's every remark. "I think you are right, maître." "Listen then, Michel. That ship will be alongside of us in less than half an hour. As she comes up, they will open on us with musketry." "They will open on us," repeated Michel, looking quite interested. "But how do you know they will do that, maître?" "Because her captain has got to obey what is in my mind," said Peyrol, in a tone of positive and solemn conviction. "He will do it as sure as if I were at his ear telling him what to do. He will do it, because he is a first-rate seaman. But I, Michel, I am just a little bit cleverer than he." He glanced over his shoulder at the Amelia rushing after the tartan with swelling sails, and raised his voice suddenly. "He will do it because no more than half a mile ahead of us is the spot where Peyrol will die." Michel did not start. He only shut his eyes for a time, and the rover continued in a lower tone. "I may be shot through the heart at once," he said, "and in that case you have my permission to let go the halyards if you are alive yourself. But if I live, I mean to put the helm down. When I do that, you will let go the foresheet to help the tartan to fly into the wind's eye. This is my last order to you. Now go forward, and fear nothing. Adieu." Michel obeyed without a word. Half a dozen of the Amelia's marines stood ranged on the forecastle head, ready with their muskets. Captain Vincent walked into the lee waist to watch his chase. When he thought that the jibboom of the Amelia had drawn level with the stern of the tartan, he waved his hat, and the marines discharged their muskets. Apparently, no gear was cut. Captain Vincent observed the white-headed man who was steering clap his hand to his left side while he hove the tiller to leeward and brought the tartan sharply into the wind. The marines on the poop fired in their turn, all the reports merging into one. Voices were heard on the decks crying that they had hit the white-haired chap. Captain Vincent shouted to the master, "Get the ship round on the other tack!" The elderly seaman who was the master of the Amelia took a critical look before he gave the necessary orders, and the Amelia closed on her chase, with her decks resounding to the piping of boatswain's mates and the hoarse shout, "Hands shorten sail! About ship!" Peyrol, lying on his back under the swinging tiller, heard the calls shrilling and dying away. He heard the ominous rush of the Amelia's bow wave as the sloop foamed within 10 yards of the tartan's stern. He even saw her upper yards coming down, and then everything vanished out of the clouded sky. There was nothing in his ears but the sound of the wind, the wash of the waves buffeting the little craft left without guidance, and the continuous thrashing of its foresail, the sheet of which Michel had let go according to orders. The tartan began to roll heavily, but Peyrol's right arm was sound, and he managed to put it round a bollard to prevent himself from being flung about. A feeling of peace sank into him, not unmingled with pride. Everything he had planned had come to pass. He had meant to play that man a trick, and now the trick had been played. Played by him better than by any other old man on whom age had stolen unnoticed, till the veil of peace was torn down by the touch of a sentiment unexpected like an intruder and cruel like an enemy. Peyrol rolled his head to the left. All he could see were the legs of Citizen Chevola, sliding nervelessly to and fro to the rolling of the vessel, as if his body had been jammed somewhere. Dead? Or only scared to death? And Michel? Was he dead or dying? That man without friends, whom his pity had refused to leave behind, marooned on the earth, without even a dog for company. As to that, Peyrol felt no compunction. But he thought he would have liked to see Michel once more. He tried to utter his name, but his throat refused him even a whisper. He felt himself removed far away from that world of human sounds in which Arlette had screamed at him, "Peyrol, don't you dare!" He would never hear anybody's voice again. Under that gray sky there was nothing for him but the swish of breaking seas and the ceaseless, furious beating of the tartan's foresail. His plaything was knocking about terribly under him, with her tiller flying madly to and fro just clear of his head, and solid lumps of water coming on board over his prostrate body. Suddenly, in a desperate lurch which brought the whole Mediterranean with a ferocious snarl level with the slope of the little deck, Peyrol saw the Amelia bearing right down upon the tartan. The fear, not of death, but of failure, gripped his slowing down heart. Was this blind Englishman going to run him down and sink the dispatches together with the craft? With a mighty effort of his ebbing strength, Peyrol sat up and flung his arm round the shroud of the mainmast. The Amelia, whose way had carried her past the tartan for a quarter of a mile before sail could be shortened and her yards swung on the other tack, was coming back to take possession of her chase. In the deepening dusk and amongst the foaming seas, it was a matter of difficulty to make out the little craft. At the very moment when the master of the man-of-war, looking out anxiously from the forecastle head, thought that she might perhaps have filled and gone down, he caught sight of her rolling in the trough of the sea, and so close that she seemed to be at the end of the Amelia's jibboom. His heart flew in his mouth. "Hard a starboard!" he yelled, his order being passed along the decks. Peyrol, sinking back on the deck in another heavy lurch of his craft, saw for an instant the whole of the English corvette swing up into the clouds as if she meant to fling herself upon his very breast. A blown sea-top flicked his face noisily, followed by a smooth interval, a silence of the waters. He beheld in a flash the days of his manhood, of strength and adventure. Suddenly an enormous voice, like the roar of an angry sea lion, seemed to fill the whole of the empty sky in a mighty and commanding shout, "Steady!" And with the sound of that familiar English word ringing in his ears, Peyrol smiled to his visions and died. The Amelia, stripped down to her topsails and hove to, rose and fell easily, while on her quarter, about a cable's length away, Peyrol's tartan tumbled like a lifeless corpse amongst the seas. Captain Vincent, in his favorite attitude of leaning over the rail, kept his eyes fastened on his prize. Mr. Bolt, who had been sent for, waited patiently till his commander turned round. "Oh, here you are, Mr. Bolt. I have sent for you to go and take possession. You speak French, and there may still be somebody alive in her. If so, of course you will send him on board at once. I am sure there can be nobody unwounded there. It will anyhow be too dark to see much, but just have a good look round and secure everything in the way of papers you can lay your hands on. Haul aft the foresheet and sail her up to receive a tow line. I intend to take her along and ransack her thoroughly in the morning, tear down the cuddy linings and so on, should you not find at once what I expect." Captain Vincent, his white teeth gleaming in the dusk, gave some further orders in a lower tone, and Mr. Bolt departed in a hurry. Half an hour afterwards he was back on board, and the Amelia, with the tartan in tow, made sail to the eastward, in search of the blockading fleet. Mr. Bolt, introduced into a cabin strongly lighted by a swinging lamp, tendered to his captain across the table a sailcloth package, corded, and sealed, and a piece of paper folded in 4, which, he explained, seemed to be a certificate of registry, strangely enough mentioning no name. Captain Vincent seized the gray canvas package eagerly. "This looks like the very thing, Bolt," he said, turning it over in his hands. "What else did you find on board?" Bolt said that he had found 3 dead men, 2 on the afterdeck and 1 lying at the bottom of the open hold with the bare end of the foresheet in his hand. "Shot down, I suppose, just as he had let it go," he commented. He described the appearance of the bodies and reported that he had disposed of them according to orders. In the tartan's cabin there was half a demijohn of wine and a loaf of bread in a locker. Also on the floor, a leather valise containing an officer's uniform coat and a change of clothing. He had lighted the lamp and saw that the linen was marked E. Real. An officer's sword on a broad shoulder belt was also lying on the floor. These things could not have belonged to the old chap with the white hair, who was a big man. "Looks as if somebody had tumbled overboard," commented Bolt. 2 of the bodies looked nondescript, but there was no doubt about that fine old fellow being a seaman. "By heavens," said Captain Vincent, "he was that. Do you know, Bolt, that he nearly managed to escape us? Another 20 minutes would have done it. How many wounds had he?" "3, I think, sir. I did not look closely," said Bolt. "I hated the necessity of shooting brave men like dogs," said Captain Vincent. "Still, it was the only way. And there may be something here," he went on, slapping the package with his open palm, "that will justify me in my own eyes. You may go now." Captain Vincent did not turn in, but only lay down, fully dressed, on the couch, till the officer of the watch, appearing at the door, told him that a ship of the fleet was in sight away to windward. Captain Vincent ordered the private night signal to be made. When he came on deck, the towering shadow of a line of battle ship that seemed to reach to the very clouds was well within hail, and a voice bellowed from her through a speaking trumpet. "What ship is that?" "His Majesty's sloop Amelia," hailed back Captain Vincent. "What ship is that, pray?" Instead of the usual answer, there was a short pause, and another voice spoke boisterously through the trumpet. "Is that you, Vincent? Don't you know the Superb when you see her?" "Not in the dark, Keats. How are you?" "I am in a hurry to speak the Admiral." "The fleet is lying by," came the voice, now with painstaking distinctness, across the murmurs, whispers, and splashes of the black lane of water dividing the 2 ships. "The Admiral bears SSE. If you stretch on till daylight as you are, you will fetch him on the other tack in time for breakfast on board the Victory. Is anything up?" At every slight roll, the sails of the Amelia, becalmed by the bulk of the 74, flapped gently against the masts. "Not much," hailed Captain Vincent. "I made a prize." "Have you been in action?" came the swift inquiry. No. Piece of luck." "Where's your prize?" roared the speaking trumpet with interest. "In my desk," roared Captain Vincent in reply. "Enemy dispatches. I say, Keats, fill on your ship. Fill on her, I say, or you'll be falling on board of me." He stamped his foot impatiently. "Clap some hands at once on the tow line and run that tartan close under our stern," he called to the officer of the watch, "or else the old Superb will walk over her without ever knowing anything about it." When Captain Vincent presented himself on board the Victory, it was too late for him to be invited to share the Admiral's breakfast. He was told that Lord Nelson had not been seen on deck yet that morning, and presently word came that he wished to see Captain Vincent at once in his cabin. Being introduced, the captain of the Amelia, in undress uniform, with a sword by his side and his hat under his arm, was received kindly, made his bow, and with a few words of explanation laid the packet on the big round table at which sat a silent secretary in black clothes, who had been obviously writing a letter from his lordship's dictation. The Admiral had been walking up and down, and after he had greeted Captain Vincent, he resumed his pacing of a nervous man. His empty sleeve had not yet been pinned on his breast, and swung slightly every time he turned in his walk. His thin locks fell lank against the pale cheeks, and the whole face in repose had an expression of suffering with which the fire of his one eye presented a startling contrast. He stopped short and exclaimed while Captain Vincent towered over him in a respectful attitude. A tartan? Captured on board a tartan? How on earth did you pitch upon that one out of the hundreds you must see every month? I must confess that I got hold accidentally of some curious information, said Captain Vincent. It was all a piece of luck. End of section 17. Section 18 of The Rover. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Theoden Humphrey. The Rover by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 16, Part 2. While the secretary was ripping open with a penknife the cover of the dispatches, Lord Nelson took Captain Vincent out into the stern gallery. The quiet and sunshiny morning had the added charm of a cool, light breeze, and the Victory, under her 3 topsails and lower staysails, was moving slowly to the southward in the midst of the scattered fleet, carrying for the most part the same sail as the Admiral. Only far away 2 or 3 ships could be seen covered with canvas trying to close with the flag. Captain Vincent noted with satisfaction that the first lieutenant of the Amelia had been obliged to brace by his after-yards in order not to overrun the Admiral's quarter. "Why," exclaimed Lord Nelson suddenly, after looking at the sloop for a moment, "you have that tartan in tow!" "I thought that your lordship would perhaps like to see a 40-ton lateen craft which has led such a chase to, I dare say, the fastest sloop in His Majesty's service." "How did it all begin?" asked the Admiral, continuing to look at the Amelia. "As I have already hinted to your lordship, certain information came in my way," began Captain Vincent, who did not think it necessary to enlarge upon that part of the story. "This tartan, which is not very different to look at from the other tartans along the coast between Cette and Genoa, had started from a cove on the Gagin Peninsula. An old man with a white head of hair was entrusted with the service, and really, they could have found nobody better. He came round Cape Esterel, intending to pass through the Hyères roadstead. Apparently he did not expect to find the Amelia in his way, and it was there that he made his only mistake. If he had kept on his course, I would probably have taken no more notice of him than of 2 other craft that were in sight then. But he acted suspiciously by hauling up for the battery on Peyrol. This maneuver, in connection with the information of which I spoke, decided me to overhaul him and see what he had on board. Captain Vincent then related concisely the episodes of the chase. "I assure your lordship that I never gave an order with greater reluctance than to open musketry fire on that craft. But the old man had given such proofs of his seamanship and determination that there was nothing else for it. Why, at the very moment he had the Amelia alongside of him, he still made a most clever attempt to prolong the chase. There were only a few minutes of daylight left, and in the darkness we might very well have lost him. Considering that they all could have saved their lives simply by striking their sails on deck, I cannot refuse them my admiration, and especially to the white-haired man." The Admiral, who had been all the time looking absently at the Amelia, keeping her station with the tartan in tow, said, "You have a very smart little ship, Vincent, very fit for the work I have given you to do. French built, isn't she?" "Yes, my lord. They are great shipbuilders." "You don't seem to hate the French, Vincent," said the Admiral, smiling faintly. "Not that kind, my lord," said Captain Vincent with a bow. "I detest their political principles and the characters of their public men. But your lordship will admit that for courage and determination we could not have found worthier adversaries anywhere on this globe." "I never said they were to be despised," said Lord Nelson. "Resource, courage, yes. If that Toulon fleet gives me the slip, all our squadrons from Gibraltar to Brest will be in jeopardy. Why don't they come out and be done with it? Don't I keep far enough out of their way?" he cried. Vincent remarked the nervous agitation of the frail figure, with a concern augmented by a fit of coughing which came on the Admiral. He was quite alarmed by its violence. He watched the commander-in-chief in the Mediterranean choking and gasping so helplessly that he felt compelled to turn his eyes away from the painful spectacle. But he noticed also how quickly Lord Nelson recovered from the subsequent exhaustion. "This is anxious work, Vincent," he said. "It is killing me. I aspire to repose somewhere in the country, in the midst of fields, out of reach of the sea and the admiralty, and dispatches and orders, and responsibility too. I have just been finishing a letter to tell them at home I have hardly enough breath in my body to carry me on from day to day. But I am like that white-headed man you admire so much, Vincent," he pursued, with a weary smile. "I will stick to my task, till perhaps some shot from the enemy puts an end to everything. Let us see what there may be in those papers you have brought on board." The secretary in the cabin had arranged them in separate piles. "What is it all about?" asked the admiral, beginning again to pace restlessly up and down the cabin. "At the first glance, the most important, my lord, are the orders from marine authorities in Corsica and Naples to make certain dispositions in view of an expedition to Egypt." "I always thought so," said the admiral, his eye gleaming at the attentive countenance of Captain Vincent. "This is a smart piece of work on your part, Vincent. I can do no better than send you back to your station. Yes, Egypt, the East. Everything points that way," he soliloquized under Vincent's eyes, while the secretary, picking up the papers with care, rose quietly and went out to have them translated and to make an abstract for the admiral. "And yet, who knows?" exclaimed Lord Nelson, standing still for a moment. "But the blame or the glory must be mine alone. I will seek counsel from no man." Captain Vincent felt himself forgotten, invisible, less than a shadow in the presence of a nature capable of such vehement feelings. "How long can he last?" he asked himself with sincere concern. The admiral, however, soon remembered his presence, and at the end of another 10 minutes, Captain Vincent left the Victory, feeling, like all officers who approached Lord Nelson, that he had been speaking with a personal friend, and with a renewed devotion for the great sea officer's soul dwelling in the frail body of the commander-in-chief of His Majesty's ships in the Mediterranean. While he was being pulled back to his ship, a general signal went up in the Victory for the fleet to form line, as convenient, ahead and astern of the admiral, followed by another to the Amelia to part company. Vincent accordingly gave his orders to make sail, and directing the master to shape a course for Cape Sisier, he went down into his cabin. He had been up nearly the whole of the last 3 nights, and he wanted to get a little sleep. His slumbers, however, were short and disturbed. Early in the afternoon, he found himself broad awake, and reviewing in his mind the events of the day before. The order to shoot 3 brave men in cold blood, terribly distasteful at the time, was lying heavily on him. Perhaps he had been impressed by Peyrol's white head, his obstinacy to escape him, the determination shown to the very last minute, by something in the whole episode that suggested a more than common devotion to duty and a spirit of daring defiance. With his robust health, simple good nature, and sanguine temperament touched with a little irony, Captain Vincent was a man of generous feelings and of easily moved sympathies. Yet, he reflected, they have been asking for it. There could be only one end to that affair. But the fact remains that they were defenseless and unarmed, and particularly harmless-looking, and at the same time as brave as any. That old chap now. He wondered how much of exact truth there was in Simons's tale of adventure. He concluded that the facts must have been true, but that Simons's interpretation of them made it extraordinarily difficult to discover what really there was under all that. That craft certainly was fit for blockade running. Lord Nelson had been pleased. Captain Vincent went on deck with the kindliest feelings towards all men, alive and dead. The afternoon had turned out very fine. The British fleet was just out of sight, with the exception of 1 or 2 stragglers under a press of canvas. A light breeze in which only the Amelia could travel at 5 knots hardly ruffled the profundity of the blue waters, basking in the warm tenderness of the cloudless sky. To south and west the horizon was empty, except for 2 specks very far apart, of which one shone white like a bit of silver, and the other appeared black like a drop of ink. Captain Vincent, with his purpose firm in his mind, felt at peace with himself. As he was easily accessible to his officers, his first lieutenant ventured a question, to which Captain Vincent replied. "He looks very thin and worn out, but I don't think he is as ill as he thinks he is. I am sure you all would like to know that his lordship is pleased with our yesterday's work. Those papers were of some importance, you know. And generally with the Amelia. It was a queer chase, wasn't it?" he went on. "That tartan was clearly and unmistakably running away from us. But she never had a chance against the Amelia." During the latter part of that speech, the first lieutenant glanced astern as if asking himself how long Captain Vincent proposed to drag that tartan behind the Amelia. The 2 keepers in her wondered also as to when they would be permitted to get back on board their ship. Simons, who was one of them, declared that he was sick and tired of steering the blamed thing. Moreover, the company on board made him uncomfortable, for Simons was aware that in pursuance of Captain Vincent's orders, Mr. Bolt had had the 3 dead Frenchmen carried into the cuddy, which he afterwards secured with an enormous padlock that apparently belonged to it, and had taken the key on board the Amelia. As to one of them, Simons's unforgiving verdict was that it would have served him right to be thrown ashore for crows to peck his eyes out. And anyhow, he could not understand why he should have been turned into the coxswain of a floating hearse, and be damned to it, he grumbled interminably. Just about sunset, which is the time of burials at sea, the Amelia was hove to, and, the rope being manned, the tartan was brought alongside, and her 2 keepers ordered on board their ship. Captain Vincent, leaning over with his elbows on the rail, seemed lost in thought. At last the first lieutenant spoke. "What are we going to do with that tartan, sir? Our men are on board." "We are going to sink her by gunfire," declared Captain Vincent suddenly. "His ship makes a very good coffin for a seaman, and those men deserve better than to be thrown overboard to roll on the waves. Let them rest quietly at the bottom of the sea, in the craft to which they had stuck so well." The lieutenant, making no reply, waited for some more positive order. Every eye on the ship was turned on the captain, but Captain Vincent said nothing, and seemed unable or unwilling to give it yet. He was feeling vaguely that in all his good intentions there was something wanting. "Ah, Mr. Bolt," he said, catching sight of the master's mate in the waist. "Did they have a flag on board that craft?" "I think she had a tiny bit of ensign when the chase began, sir, but it must have been blown away. It is not at the end of her mainyard now." He looked over the side. "The halyards are rove, though," he added. "We must have a French ensign somewhere on board," said Captain Vincent. "Certainly, sir," struck in the master, who was listening. "Well, Mr. Bolt," said Captain Vincent, "you have had most to do with all this. Take a few men with you, bend the French ensign on the halyards, and sway his main yard to the masthead." He smiled at all the faces turned towards him. After all, they never surrendered, and by heavens, gentlemen, we will let them go down with their colors flying. A profound but not disapproving silence reigned over the decks of the ship, while Mr. Bolt, with 3 or 4 hands, was busy executing the order. Then suddenly above the topgallant rail of the Amelia appeared the upper curve of a lateen yard, with the tricolour drooping from the point. A subdued murmur from all hands greeted this apparition. At the same time, Captain Vincent ordered the line holding the tartan alongside to be cast off, and the main yard of the Amelia to be swung round. The sloop, shooting ahead of her prize, left her stationary on the sea, then putting the helm up, ran back abreast of her on the other side. The port bow gun was ordered to fire around, aiming well forward. That shot, however, went just over, taking the foremast out of the tartan. The next was more successful, striking the little hull between wind and water, and going out well under water on the other side. A third was fired, as the men said, just for luck, and that too took effect, a splintered hole appearing at the bow. After that, the guns were secured, and the Amelia, with no brace being touched, was brought to her course towards Cape Sisier. All hands on board of her, with their backs to the sunset sky, clear like a pale topaz above the hard blue gem of the sea, watched the tartan give a sudden dip, followed by a slow, unchecked dive. At last the tricolour flag alone remained visible for a tense and interminable moment, pathetic and lonely, in the centre of a brimful horizon. All at once it vanished, like a flame blown upon, bringing to the beholders the sense of having been left face to face with an immense, suddenly created solitude. On the decks of the Amelia, a low murmur died out. When Lieutenant Real sailed away with the Toulon fleet on the great strategical cruise which was to end in the Battle of Trafalgar, Madame Real returned, with her aunt, to her hereditary house at Escampa Bar. She had only spent a few weeks in town, where she was not much seen in public. The lieutenant and his wife lived in a little house near the western gate, and the lieutenant's official position, though he was employed on the staff to the last, was not sufficiently prominent to make her absence from official ceremonies at all remarkable. But this marriage was an object of mild interest in naval circles. Those, mostly men, who had seen Madame Real at home, told stories of her dazzling complexion, of her magnificent black eyes, of her personal and attractive strangeness, and of the Arlésienne costume she insisted on wearing, even after her marriage to an officer of the Navy, being herself sprung from farmer stock. It was also said that her father and mother had fallen victims in the massacres of Toulon after the evacuation of the town. But all those stories varied in detail and were on the whole very vague. Whenever she went abroad, Mrs. Real was attended by her aunt, who aroused almost as much curiosity as herself, a magnificent old woman with upright carriage and an austere, brown, wrinkled face, showing signs of past beauty. Catherine was also seen alone in the streets, where, as a matter of fact, people turned round to look after the thin and dignified figure, remarkable amongst the passers-by, whom she herself did not seem to see. About her escape from the massacres, most wonderful tales were told, and she acquired the reputation of a heroine. Arlette's aunt was known to frequent the churches, which were all open to the faithful now, carrying even into the house of God her sibylline aspect of a prophetess and her austere manner. It was not at the services that she was seen most. People would see her oftener in an empty nave, standing slim and as straight as an arrow in the shade of a mighty pillar, as if making a call on the Creator of all things, with whom she had made her peace generously, and now would petition only for pardon and reconciliation with her niece Arlette. For Catherine for a long time remained uncertain of the future. She did not get rid of her involuntary awe of her niece as a selected object of God's wrath until towards the end of her life. There was also another soul for which she was concerned. The pursuit of the tartan by the Amelia had been observed from various points of the islands that close the roadstead of Hyères, and the English ship had been seen from the Fort de la Vigie, opening fire on her chase. The result, though the two vessels soon ran out of sight, could not be a matter of doubt. There was also the story told by a coaster that got into Fréjus, of a tartan being fired on by a square-rigged man-of-war, but that apparently was the next day. All these rumors pointed one way and were the foundation of the report made by Lieutenant Real to the Toulon Admiralty. That Peyrol went out to sea in his tartan and was never seen again was, of course, an incontrovertible fact. The day before the two women were to go back to Escampa Bar, Catherine approached a priest in the church of Saint-Marie-Majeur, a little unshaven fat man with a watery eye, in order to arrange for some masses to be said for the dead. "But for whose soul are we to pray?" mumbled the priest in a wheezy, low tone. "Pray for the soul of Jean," said Catherine. "Yes, Jean. There is no other name." Lieutenant Real, wounded at Trafalgar but escaping capture, retired with the rank of Capitaine de Frégate, and vanished from the eyes of the naval world in Toulon, and indeed from the world altogether. Whatever sign brought him back to Escampa on that momentous night was not meant to call him to his death, but to a quiet and retired life, obscure in a sense, but not devoid of dignity. In the course of years he became the mayor of the commune in that very same little village which had looked on Escampa as the abode of iniquity, the sojourn of blood drinkers, and of wicked women. One of the earliest excitements breaking the monotony of the Escampa life was the discovery at the bottom of the well, one dry year when the water got very low, of some considerable obstruction. After a lot of trouble in getting it up, the obstruction turned out to be a garment made of sailcloth, which had armholes and 3 horn buttons in front, and looked like a waistcoat. But it was lined, positively quilted, with a surprising quantity of gold pieces of various ages, coinages, and nationalities. Nobody but Peyrol could have put it there. Catherine was able to give the exact date, because she remembered seeing him doing something at the well on the very morning before he went out to sea with Michel, carrying off Chauvelin. Captain Real could guess easily the origin of that treasure, and he decided with his wife's approval to give it up to the government as the hoard of a man who had died intestate, with no discoverable relations, and whose very name had been a matter of uncertainty even to himself. After that event, the uncertain name of Peyrol found itself oftener and oftener on Monsieur and Madame Real's lips, on which before it was but seldom heard, though the recollection of his white-headed, quiet, irresistible personality haunted every corner of the Escampa fields. From that time they talked of him openly, as though he had come back to live again amongst them. Many years afterwards, one fine evening, Monsieur and Madame Real, sitting on the bench outside the salle, the house had not been altered at all outside, except that it was now kept whitewashed, began to talk of that episode, and of the man who, coming from the seas, had crossed their lives to disappear at sea again. "How did he get all that lot of gold?" wondered Madame Real innocently. "He could not possibly want it. And, Eugène, why should he have put it down there?" "That, ma chère amie," said Real, "is not an easy question to answer. Men and women are not so simple as they seem. Even you, fermière," he used to give his wife that name jocularly sometimes, "are not so simple as some people would take you to be. I think that if Peyrol were here, he could not perhaps answer your question himself." And they went on, reminding each other in short phrases separated by long silences of his peculiarities of person and behavior, when, above the slope leading down to Madrague, there appeared, first the pointed ears, and then the whole body of a very diminutive donkey, of a light grey color with dark points. 2 pieces of wood, strangely shaped, projected on each side of his body as far as his head, like very long shafts of a cart. But the donkey dragged no cart after him. He was carrying on his back, on a small pack saddle, the torso of a man who did not seem to have any legs. The little animal, beautifully groomed and with an intelligent and even impudent physiognomy, stopped in front of Monsieur and Madame Real. The man, balancing himself cleverly on the pack saddle with his withered legs crossed in front of him, slipped off, disengaged his crutches from each side of the donkey smartly, propped himself on them, and with his open palm gave the animal a resounding thwack, which sent it trotting into the yard. The cripple of the Madrague, in his quality of Peyrol's friend, for the Rover had often talked of him both to the women and to Lieutenant Real with great appreciation, "C'est un homme, ça," had become a member of the Escampa community. His employment was to run about the country on errands, most unfit, one would think, for a man without legs. But the donkey did all the walking, while the cripple supplied the sharp wits and an unfailing memory. The poor fellow, snatching off his hat and holding it with one hand alongside his right crutch, approached to render his account of the day in the simple words, "Everything has been done as you ordered, madame," then lingered, a privileged servant, familiar but respectful, attractive with his soft eyes, long face, and his pained smile. "We were just talking of Peyrol," remarked Captain Real. "Ah, one could talk a long time of him," said the cripple. "He told me once that if I had been complete, with legs like everybody else, I suppose he meant, I would have made a good comrade away there in the distant seas. He had a great heart." "Yes," murmured Madame Real thoughtfully. Then, turning to her husband, she asked, "What sort of man was he really, Eugène?" Captain Real remained silent. "Did you ever ask yourself that question?" she insisted. "Yes," said Real. "But the only certain thing we can say of him is that he was not a bad Frenchman." "Everything's in that," murmured the cripple, with fervent conviction, in the silence that fell upon Real's words and Arlette's faint sigh of memory. The blue level of the Mediterranean, the charmer and the deceiver of audacious men, kept the secret of its fascination, hugged to its calm breast the victims of all the wars, calamities, and tempests of its history, under the marvelous purity of the sunset sky. A few rosy clouds floated high up over the Estoril range. The breath of the evening breeze came to cool the heated rocks of Escampobar, and the mulberry tree, the only big tree on the head of the peninsula, standing like a sentinel at the gate of the yard, sighed faintly in a shudder of all its leaves, as if regretting the brother of the coast, the man of dark deeds, but of large heart, who often at noonday would lie down to sleep under its shade. End of section 18. End of The Rover by Joseph Conrad.